Hi guys, I'm here to talk to you about another comparison between two weapons from two different cultures. And in this particular case, we're going to be comparing the European longsword, by that we mean the sword to be used in two hands, with the Japanese katana. This is the kind of topic that comes up all the time. Normally it is sort of what would happen between samurai and an armoured knight. And yeah, you could talk about that, but that's not what we're really interested in this particular video. Most of what we practice for is unarmoured combat, the sort of stuff people use for self-defense and dueling and all that kind of stuff. So, context, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking unarmoured opponents in a civilian context. Now, did that happen with these two particular swords? Well, they were both carried for that purpose, it's certainly true. Did they ever meet one another, like, say, the other European swords in the Renaissance had done, such as things like rapiers and side swords? Well, there's no documented evidence that I've actually seen so far, and when Europeans made contact with the Japanese, the longsword was already going out of favour. Still around, but going out of favour. So did they ever meet? It's hard to tell. So we haven't got any anecdotal information to actually work from, or primary source information, so we can only compare like for like and work from there. Now you will see it in our actual sparring videos. Again, with our other sort of mixed weapon stuff, people jump to conclusions. So it's better explained with a video like this where I can actually give a fair comparison of the two weapons. To understand them, we need to actually look at some rough stats of what the kind of swords are like. In this particular video, I've got an Albion, which Albion makes some of the best researched and constructed swords you'll find. In this particular case, it's a very small longsword. It's what we would call a hand and a half or a bastard sword, in that it's a sword that can be used in one or two hands. Funny enough, a bit like the katana that I have here, which is almost of an exact same size. Again, a sword that's really used in two hands, but can be used in one. So we need to look at some specification of the two. The katana I've got there is about 1 kilo. The Albion I've got, this hand and a half, is 1.3 kilos. So you're talking about 30% more weight. The blade is just 2 inches longer than the katana. It's a small end of the scale. That katana is roughly sort of average. This longsword is below average, but it's perfect for this video because I can actually get it in easily, you can see it, and it's ideal, and it's a nice quality sword. But in terms of if you compare the two, katana to longsword, well, the scale for both of them is vast. But if you try and look at what's common, you will find that a katana on average, depending on the time period, but on average is something like 27 to 29 inch blade, whereas a longsword is more like 34 to about 37 inch blade. So you're going to talk about maybe a longsword is approximately 30% larger, and that goes along with weight, as you expect a katana to average around about 900 grams, kilos, something like that, and a European longsword to weigh 1.3 to about 1.5 kilos. So the whole thing you're talking about, size and weight, is proportional. Well, it's in proportion. So the longsword is 30% larger, weight and length. So there's some specifications for you. In terms of cutting power, the katana is known as an exceptional cutter. And unfortunately, if you watch some documentaries on European swords, or often where they compare the two, you'll have them talking about European swords not being able to cut well, particularly because they got straight blades. Now, the Europeans had plenty of curved blades throughout the centuries. So again, you've got to consider, why did they have straight blades? Were they bad cutters? Were they good cutters? Well, long swords, they do exist in curved blades, but you will find the vast majority of surviving examples have straight. So I think that gives you a good indication as to how well they can cut. If they cut badly, they would have gone to curved blades, but there's more to consider because we've got to look at the point work as well. So how well do the two of them cut? Having a curved blade does improve the sword's ability to cut. It naturally slices better. When you cut with a sword, you don't just beat like a baseball bat, you have to actually deliver some force for that blunt force trauma and draw at the same time. And that technique is used both with the katana and the longsword. So despite the fact that katana does naturally draw slightly because it's got a bit of curve to it, they still practice to draw through their cuts because you will cut much deeper. We're not hitting each other with clubs. This is actually a sharp sword, and you can't just beat on an object like this. You strike and draw through, or strike and draw forwards. So the katana will slice slightly better, that's true, and a European longsword, typically longer, straight-bladed, will deliver a little bit more blunt force trauma. So that's a sort of a quick overview of the blades. The point work. Now, the points of longswords vary quite a lot throughout the different time periods. This is a very acutely shaped blade, which is exceptionally good at thrusting, and you will find a massive variety. So there's no simple answer to that, but overall you will find that the European longsword has a tip which is better suited to thrusting than the katana. The katana is much more focused on the cut, and the European longsword tends to be more like a, no, I wouldn't say much 50-50, but maybe 60% cut, 40% thrust. There are arguments either way, but there's a lot more thrust work with the katana, with the longsword, and it's much better suited to it. Then you go on to the protection that the two of them offer. So with the katana, you obviously have a very small actual guard, and with the longswords, again, they can vary a bit, but we've got a nice simple cruciform sort of hilt here. How does it offer different levels of protection? Well, like most swords, you should never intend to parry with the guard or the hilt, but it does happen. And what you'll find is that the more guard you have, not just more protection you offer to your hands, but often to parts of the body as well. So you will find in the fight that this cross guard does offer more protection than the katana guard does, but it's marginal. In looking at the durability of the two blades, there's not enough evidence to show exactly how durable one is over the other. There have been lots of tests, and they tend to find that the European blades are a little bit stronger or a little bit more resilient, in that the edges are harder on the katana, which means they can hold their edge for longer, but they're a little bit more prone to taking edge damage as a result because they have those harder edges, and also because basically the spine can sort of break on them. Now, I don't think there have been enough tests to conclusively say which is stronger. There is a lot of evidence documented of both blades breaking in combat. So I would say to that, which is more durable in combat, it's going to come down to how substantial the blade is. If you've got a very light-bladed katana, then it's going to be more likely to break, and if you've got a more light-bladed, very acutely tapered longsword, you're more likely to lose some of the tip. So I think that's down to the individual sword more than anything else. The other thing to consider there is the katana does emphasise not cutting with the edge to actually protect the sword, because it was known to be a vulnerability, and yet the longsword has techniques that specifically go edge to edge. So that might give an indicator of a slight strength to the longsword. However, of course, if you're using the katana according to sort of Japanese principles, you should be avoiding the kind of contact that's going to do you damage. So that's neither here nor there, really. Now looking at which sword would I rather use, because that's what it's going to come down to, is that if you look at these two swords, which is better in combat? Well, your katana cuts a little bit better, the longsword thrusts a little bit better. It's marginal differences here and there. If you deliver a solid cut or thrust with either sword, you're going to deliver an incapacitating or killing blow, and that's no doubt. So it's, if you use the sword well, you will deliver an incapacitating or killing blow, whichever you've got. Now, which would I personally use? Which would I prefer? Well, a bit like when we talked about with the rapier compared to the katana, the draw time on a katana is incredibly fast. Not only because it's a little bit smaller, but also because they practice the draw an awful lot and actually draw into the cut. So again, if you've not got much time to draw, the katanas can have a slight advantage. And in confined spaces, a lot of the long swords are going to be a little bit longer than equivalent katanas, so you've got a slight advantage there. But if you're talking about open space fight, unarmoured, where you've both got swords drawn, I would always go on the longer blade. Longer swords have an advantage over shorter swords in that environment up to a reasonable length. Eventually they can become unwieldy. But overall, I would go with the longer blade. And you can find excessively long, no, not excessively, but exceptionally long Japanese swords. You can find exceptionally long European swords. But if we're looking at averages, like for like, the European sword's going to come out at about 30% larger than the equivalent katana. And therefore, I would pick the longsword in that nice open environment with swords drawn. So there you go, there you have it. Good overview of the two swords. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe.